Yeah, well, yeah. Better. Gail and I talked. So she's like,
Well, good afternoon, friends. Welcome to Grace St. Luke's, or if you've just joined us, or you're continuing to be with us after a good, strong, robust service of baptism and life here at Grace St. Luke's. The Social Justice Committee is thrilled to offer a thoughtful panel around education and equity, and wants to introduce our strong panelists and facilitator. The first introduction I'd like to make is with Cardell Oren, right here. Cardell grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, being dragged to school board meetings and marches along with his sisters by an activist mother concerned with justice, equity, and building parental power to make sure students receive high-quality education. Community engagement was modeled every day, and it was not so much taught as ingrained in their being. Cardell's father, a social justice activist, helped organize a weekly student walkout protest called Black Mondays that resulted in the first African-American school board members election in Memphis. And so with this foundation, serving as the Memphis City Director for Stand for Children is like coming home to full circle. He has served as founder and principal of Links Consulting. Over 10 years, Cardell was involved in projects that stretched across a wide breadth of areas, including strategic planning, community development, communications, and community engagement. Prior to this, he also served as Chief Information Officer at Lemoyne Owen College here in Memphis. One other, Cardell also co-founded New Path, a local political action committee focused on engaging young people in the political process. Cardell is a founding board member of Hattie Lou Theater, Memphis Urban League Young Professionals, and the Benjamin Hooks Institute for Social Change Advisory Board. Cardell attended public schools here in Memphis through high school, at which time he had the opportunity to attend Phillips Academy, Andover in Massachusetts. Cardell graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering in Computer Science and Engineering, with additional studies in African American Studies and Entrepreneurial Management. And I really enjoyed this part too. Cardell continues the family tradition of dragging his young daughter, Samira, to her first campaign meeting before she turned 1. Cardell Oren, would you give a round of applause? We welcome back to Grace St. Luke's Dr. Russ Wigginton. Dr. Russ Wigginton serves as the president of the National Civil Rights Museum. Prior to assuming this role, Russ served as the Chief Post-Secondary Impact Officer for Tennessee State Collaborative on Reforming Education from 2019 to 2021, where he led the organization's work for post-secondary access, retention, and completion. Previously, he served as Vice President for Student Life and Dean of Students at Rhodes College from 2017 to 2019, where he oversaw the college's co-curricular experience for students. Russ taught 8 years in the history department at Rhodes, specializing in African American and community history. He is a published author and essayist, and Russ has served on numerous civic boards and advisory committees. Russ graduated from Rhodes with a BA in history and earned a PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He also has a son, Ryan, a 22 graduate from the University of Richmond, and is married to Tamika Hart Wigginton. And I'm going to introduce her next, but please give Russ a round of applause. She knows Russ very well. Tamika Hart Wigginton is the Managing Director for Blue Meridian Partners. Prior to joining at Blue Meridian, Tamika served as Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, leading education policy and advocacy grant-making to civil rights and equity organizations. Before this, she served as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at the Southern Education Foundation, where she supported the foundation's work to improve student outcomes from early childhood to adulthood, and helped implement a broad range of advocacy, research, and coalition building activities impacting public education across the Southern region. Tamika served 2 terms on the Memphis City Shelby County Schools Board, including a term as board president. Tamika holds a certificate in education finance from Georgetown University, a JD from the University of Memphis, and an MBA from Kennesaw State University. She received her BS in marketing education from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She will be our facilitator today. Wonderful, brave woman. We welcome all 3, and we welcome you to this good place.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for the invitation and opportunity to share with you today, specifically to Nikki Soule for reaching out. So when she reached out, she actually asked if I would come and speak. And then I just bullied 2 of my favorite people in the world to join me here. As you know, Russ is my husband, and if there was such thing as a work husband, Cardell is definitely that for me. Cardell, there's probably not 2 people, there's a few other that I don't spend much more time with and communicate with on a daily basis than the 2 people you see here. And so you heard their bios and why I wanted them to join. This conversation is about education equity, centering it around the past, the present, and the future. And so I thought it best just to have a conversation versus a bunch of speeches. And so I'm going to turn to both of them regularly, but just wanted to say we want to ground this conversation just in that. And so for the past, Russ is going to help ground it first outside of what's happening in Memphis and Shelby County schools, but about the grounding of the civil rights history connected to education, to public education, so that we understand that none of this is operating in a vacuum. These things are part of systems that have been set up to get exactly the outcomes that we get. I'll come back and talk a little about grounding that more specifically in the school system, and then Cardell is going to talk. We'll continue in that conversation about the school system based on his just extensive support and activism related in this community. But before that, because one of the things that we want to make sure is clear is that this is about public education, and it doesn't matter where you're situated. It doesn't matter if you never went to public education. It doesn't matter if your children don't go to public education. Public means something, right? And it is the education system, it's all of our systems. When I ran for school board in 2004, I lived in Midtown. I lived in Ansdale Park, and so I had constituents who were members of this church. I had constituents who had kids who went to the school here, or overwhelmingly, they did not select the Memphis City schools, right? And so as I'm knocking on doors, people were like, oh, I don't vote in school board election. My kids don't go to public education. I was like, wait a minute, let's talk about why this still matters. Let's talk about why you can't continue to have that belief about the disconnect to public education. So now I say, because it is an investment that you make. If you live in this community, you are invested in this system. And I ask people, name another investment of your time and or your resources, even your money, where you just don't care about how it performs. I bet you can't name one. And so so just the notion that it's for the people who are in the system, that's also part of the problem that the system has. And so, but I wanted to ground both of them because we all have different stories. Like, I'm born and raised in Memphis. I grew up poor in Memphis, and except for 1 year when my family chose a Christian education experience for me in 2nd grade, my entire education has been in the public school system here. Started here, graduated in public education. And I'm a victim of the inequity of public education in this community. I grew up in North Memphis, public housing. We moved later to Frazier. But my schools, my neighborhood schools, are not select schools. There's poor community schools, and my high school, for instance, had 1 AP class, right? Now, there are high schools not far away that have multiple offerings, right? I went to Snowden for 1 year, but when I went back to my neighborhood school, it didn't have anywhere near the same thing that Snowden had. I was in the optional program at Snowden, but I went to Georgian Hills. I had to give up taking French because Georgian Hills didn't have French. I had to give up 8th grade algebra because Georgian Hills didn't allow it. The community in Frazier didn't make that choice. Adults made that choice. That someone else made that choice, and that's inequity and that's structural. I want to start with Cardell, just on the grounding of why are you so involved in public education. You kind of heard it, and he didn't have a choice. If you never met his mom, you got to meet his mom at some point in your life. You don't have to live until you know Cardell's mom. But it was both that grounding, as you heard him say. He went to public school in Memphis, but he also went to one of the top boarding schools, high schools in the country. And he still chose, when he came back, public education involvement. It's not because he was a graduate of the system here in Memphis. He chose for his daughter public education here. And I just want to know, just briefly, why? Why that? Because you could be like, oh, we're going to whatever school we want to and have nothing to do with this.
So I think, one, that's an interesting question on choosing public education, because we have a framing of education here, especially for folks with privilege like me, like other folks around, to have choices. And I would say that part of those choices were the slim choices that we thought as a family we had, even for public education. So getting into the right schools was a large part of my daughter going to actually receive a public education, because if she hadn't gotten into a couple of those schools, I'm sure my wife was on the standpoint of, okay, well, here's another choice that we have to make. Because whereas I might be more committed to public education, my wife, who's similar to Tamika, went through the whole system here in Memphis and Millington, has a different viewpoint of what we want for our daughter. And so, and I think a lot of that is framed around what we know is that the family life circumstances are a whole lot more relevant to the education a child receives than the school that they go to. In large part, I believe my daughter could go to any school in Memphis probably. And we would fight for her to get the best teacher in that school, and she would end up in that, but she'd also get resources outside and at home, and she would probably be okay. There are not a lot of people in our community who have those same choices, have those same resources at home, and those abilities to do that. So I think that is framing around how we think about our schools, especially when we think about our system that we've set up of choice even within our schools, with optional schools, which was started, right after desegregation occurred in busing to try to stop white flight, and now trying to stop white flight, class flight. So we set up a system of optional schools that would allow folks to feel comfortable sending their children to public education, but it still sets up a bifurcated system within a system, and sometimes within even a school building, that does not allow, when we talk about equity, does not allow us to really get to what's the best education for our children. And then I go, secondly, why I'm involved in education. It's really, I think it's similar to the question of why is education important? To me, involvement in education was kind of a practical matter. Me and some friends got together and said, hey, we want to impact our community, and we want to impact that through politics. We set up a political action committee. And it just so happened that we met a wonderful young lady who wanted to run for school board. And so if we met somebody in Tamika Hart that wanted to run for city council, we probably would have run a campaign for city council. But I think but it became more and more clear that as we worked on Tamika's campaigns, we worked on other campaigns, we helped elect school board members, city council folks, county commissioners, how important school system education is. And as Tamika mentioned, how important it is from us as a place where we position much of our public resources into that system. And so we are all, to some degree, vested in that. And what does that mean for us to move forward? And I say it's similar to the reasoning around education, because I think one of the fundamental questions that we have to ask is, what's the purpose of education? And so, as I said, as a practical standpoint, it is a clear pivot point for us as a community of how we, what our community looks like, what are the values of our community, how we move and shift our community. For children, for young people coming up through a system, to me, one of the purposes of education is for children to have a thriving life and have the greatest access to opportunities that they can. And so that is also a practical matter of what does that mean, and that's different for each child who's going through the system. And we have to create those opportunities and really think of our community and how everything that we do is a part of education, is a part of the development of our young people and our families and how they move through the system. And as a standpoint, how we succeed or not as a city, a county, a state, and on.
You see why he's here, right? So Russ, kind of the same question. I mean, you grew up, born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. Family moved to Nashville, where you finished, 12 years old, 7th grade? And so you finished your education, but all Catholic education. You grew up Catholic, your family chose Catholic education for you. For your son, you, his mom, y'all chose both Catholic and independent education, but yet you're deeply engaged in public education. In fact, Russ and I met each other because of that. He was serving on KIPP Charter School Board, but also on the school board. So growing up in Memphis, there was Southwest and there was Rhodes, and as a Memphian, as a poor Memphian, that wasn't for you. It was like, there's this pretty building over there. I don't know what the white people do over there, but black folk don't come over there, right? And so it was a very disconnect. As a high school student, I never even thought of Rhodes as an option. So surprisingly, when I'm on the school board, I'm sitting at these graduations, and all of a sudden I'm starting to hear all of these, and I'm not just talking about your usual suspect schools. Like, I'm talking about schools across the city. We're choosing Rhodes. I mean, students are saying, having Rhodes as their listed school. And I knew Russ, and so I inquired about it, and then he told me about their intentionality around building with the public school system, their intentionality around the schools around it. So what was it for you? Because you didn't have a connection otherwise for public education. Why did you choose it as a platform?
Sure. I think in the various places that I lived growing up, always plugging into the Catholic school, because there were a couple more moves in there other than the ones that Tamika just mentioned for my family. And as I got older and thinking about my obligation, or what I would say the obligation that we all have to support public education, as a historian, I take it back to the Reconstruction period. And I take it back to Reconstruction. Immediately following emancipation, there were three fundamental things that newly freed black people did. They reconnected with their families and had their marriages legitimately recognized. They built churches and they built schools. And I think about those as core values that still exist today. And when you think about the emergence of the economic discrepancy up to and through the Brown v. Board decision, and then when you fast forward to today and you get all of these either implicit or explicit assertions about what people's values must be based on where they choose to send their kids to school, I find that problematic, and I just think it's really critical that we think back and look at public education as a statement that a community is making about what it values. Everybody involved. And so it becomes less about what you choose for your individual child or children, and more about what you owe as an investment to the community. And when you think about the Brown decision as the mystique, if you will, the Brown decision being this magic equalizer in 1954, really what the Brown decision did is make the country acknowledge the inequity that had been ongoing for so long. And then the byproduct was the systematic way in which we could maintain that inequity outside of what the law said. So there's nothing wrong with sending your kid to Immaculate Conception and St. George's and boarding school at Macaulay, like I did for my child. However, if all I'm doing is thinking about him and not thinking about all of the children, the 98% of the children in Memphis who don't have that option, if they so choose, I felt an obligation to be involved in Promise Academy and KIPP Academy and any of the other public education systems, because as a citizen that cares about this community, we should all invest in creating space and opportunity for every child in this community. And when you think about what a community values, Cardell asked the question, what's the purpose of an education? If you go to what are determined to be the best schools in this country, what they don't lead with is so that you can get a good job. That's
Or
not
stay out of jail.
Or stay out of jail. That's not what they lead with for what's the purpose of an education. They talk about civility, they talk about humanity, they talk about principles, they talk about being a learned citizen, helps you reach your full potential and think about the potential of others. And so don't get me wrong, I understand why there has to be a practicality to education, but until we ground it or reground it in values, and dare I say values that came out of Reconstruction for newly freed Black people, we're not going to make these we're not going to have the sort of comprehensive investment in publication or in public education, regardless of where one chooses to send their child.
Yeah, thank you. So you kind of started where I want to go now. Again, this is about past, present, future. And it's impossible to disconnect the past from how and why we are where we are today. And so you mentioned the Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure people, is the Supreme Court decision that made segregation illegal. Some think it led to integration. There's a challenge on that about what it did, but can you just say a little more about, you talked about Reconstruction, you talked about Brown, and what happened such that the systems are still what we have today or didn't happen, especially in Memphis as it played out in Memphis? Sure,
so there was it's really about money. There was a disconnect in the money. If the money, I'll just use present day terms. If the per pupil allowance for Black students in 1954 would have been the same for white students in 1954, I believe the Black schools in Memphis would have protested the idea of desegregation. Let me say that one more time. Black people in Memphis did not want to desegregate schools any more so than whites in Memphis. They just wanted to be able to pay their teachers the same and have the resources for their students on an equal basis. We never talk about that. Because what happens is the desegregation assumes that now these students who are perceived to be getting less of an education have an opportunity to go to a school with white students and get a better education. And as we saw, not just in Memphis, really, but throughout the country, they did that kicking and screaming. And it created the comprehensive community disconnect that schools played. That's a different narrative than how we tend to think about the challenges around public education. And so Cardell mentioned, or was mentioned in the bio about Cardell's father helping with Black Mondays on desegregation. It was about the principles of desegregation so that one would have the opportunity for economic equity and opportunity equity. But when it comes to education, it's a money matter. All the other stuff is noise in the system that gets disrupted. Allocate the resources equally, and we would eliminate a lot of the conversation. The schools that supplement the per pupil are now determined to be the better schools. They don't work better with the same amount of money, they supplement their resources. Until we as a community decide to supplement the resources for the students who need those resources the most, we will continue to have challenges in our community that manifest through the educational system. Last thing I'll say, taking it all the way back, there were some national studies done across this country pre-Brown looking at major metropolitan areas where there were black high schools, right? There would be a few black high schools. Part of it depended on the demographics of the community. But if you look at this nationwide studies, a disproportionate number of educators in black high schools compared to white high schools had teachers with advanced degrees. So a much higher percentage had master's degrees than their white counterpart schools. Yet they were still paid less. And when we think about it from a gender lens, where certainly during that era, the average male wage was significantly higher than female, a black male master degree teacher earned less than his white bachelor female counterpart. Tell me it's not about money.
Yeah, I always lead with the tell me it's not about money, especially if I'm talking to people who, when you think about, so the per pupil is just a simple math of how much money do you have and how many students do you have, the division of that. It is not a measure of what actually gets to the student, right? And so in Memphis, I don't know if it's still around 12,000, and it's been hovering around 12,000 per pupil for a while, but we had some students that need 35,000. Right? There's some students that need less. And so back on the Brown, just so structurally so we can just understand. So Brown it legally said, right, you can't have segregation. You can't set up and say this school is for white and only. What it couldn't do though was integrate the schools. Like it was powerless to do that because integration is not a legal concept. It is something that people have to decide. We're going to live together in this community in harmony. So in Memphis, and many other communities, but Memphis is, like disproportionate amount of white private schools were founded and born out of that decision. So Brown was 54. There's another Brown, by the time it started getting implemented in the 70s, then there was the white flight. And so now you have schools that are left and they're poor and they're black because we don't have the opportunity for integration. And so when people will say we need to go back to, I'm like, well, there was never a time when you can say in Memphis there was a point of integration and somehow it got different. We never got to that promise. The other thing, Cardell talked about the optional schools. So in that same time, in the late 70s, Memphis created these optional schools with the spoken, like the clear thing was to keep white people from fleeing. If your goal is to keep white people from fleeing, where are those good schools? In white neighborhoods. So White Station is not a mistake. Snowden is not even a mistake. None of these schools are. The same token, North Memphis is not a mistake. What's happening in South Memphis and all these other, there's not a mistake. The system, the people who were leading the system decided that White Station would have 30 some odd AP offerings and that Tresvant, my high school, would have one. It wasn't, and if we can fill one AP class, we could have filled every other AP class. So it's not the community, the students, we were poor, but we were smart. But you gotta give me the resources, you gotta give me the same opportunities. And so when you create these opportunity gaps, and then wonder why are we having these problems that we're having today. When you talk about the difference in 12,000 per pupil and what some other, so even if I just compare it public school to public school, in poor communities, in many of Memphis City schools, I say Memphis cities, but now Shelby, there's fewer majority black, but there's still multiple majority black. We used to, when it was Memphis, there was like, most of the schools were 80% or more. We had few that were like the 40%. I mean, ideally you want no more than 40% of, concentrated low-income poverty in the school to get the right mix of what a school needs to be, to really be able to move for students. So you have this concentration of poverty, and then because people are not connected, anytime there needs to be a resource conversation, I mean, the school system, we don't sell cookies to get our money. We get our money from the taxpayer. So if people who have fled have no interest in investing more, there's no advocacy to say we do need to have more of our property taxes and other taxes to come to the system, because my kids don't go there, so I don't need to worry about that. Or my kids are in this great school, I don't need to raise taxes because in addition to that 12, we're adding another 10 just based on the things that we do. School board, you can't fix the field, that's okay, we raise the money and we're gonna fix the field ourselves. We're gonna build up this field ourselves, and people see that as great civic engagement, and I do want communities to be able to do that. But you gotta understand, well, I need to be able to do this in our communities, including the ones that they're not getting anything more than that 10,000, 12,000 that the system is paying for them. So these things are structural. It's not communities, it's not families just sitting back, don't want their kids to have a good education. And so Cardell, in that sense, again, you've been working a long time on these issues. I really do want to talk, because you can bring the more of the present, like what's happening now in the system. I could come back a whole other conversation to talk about Memphis City schools and Shelby County schools, and I would just say this. If you actually do an apples to apples comparison, like pre-merger of Memphis and Shelby County schools, if you compare, say, White Station to Arlington High School, you see this the same school. But if you're gonna try, but it's the same way people don't talk about Millington, because if you also compare Millington High School to Tresson High School, you see it's the same school. The issue is, it is a linear connection between poverty and all the other issues, right? So higher the poverty, the lower the performance of schools. Even if you compare Shelby County to, say, Williamson County, direct linear connection. The more poverty school systems have, the harder it is to educate. And then everything else that happens with that. And then regarding the structural pieces, so even as Brown said, you can't legally segregate, then what came out of Brown, the redlining, right, to ensure that Black communities, can't get resources into their community for real estate, and every other ill that was associated with oppressing a community, making sure they stayed poor, and then now some blaming them on the circumstances of the structures in which they live. But Cardell is in the now. He's been involved directly with the school system for a long time, politically and also just academically in his efforts to build out a path for students that are not being reached. So you can tell a little about Stand for Children, and then what you're doing and your view of the state of the system now, but what we can do. Now this might take a while, he's very passionate about it, and I know I'm watching the clock, but yeah, Cardell, ground us in the present and then the future of the system.
Yeah, so I think, and I think there's a correlation to some degree at what we do at Stand for Children and like where we are as a system. So Stand for Children is a national organization. It's been around since 1996. There's a big rally in DC called Stand for Children Rally. And then from that, our founders, one of them being my boss, Jonah Edelman, created Stand for Children as an organization that would engage with parents to do parent organizing and identification of what parents cared about, and then advocate for those things. And I think over those years, we've gone in and out of some of those pieces where parents were really setting the agenda, and we went into a segment of years around as education reform started becoming more of a thing nationally, and so we pushed for a lot of education reform-y kind of things, accountability, testing, choice to some degree, in large part charter schools, not necessarily vouchers, charter schools. And so all of these things that we would think of as education reform. And then I think we went through a period several years ago where our leadership, our board, looked at what we had done, and we'd had a lot of success across the country at passing bills in the state legislature in Tennessee, where Tennessee was one of the early Stand for Children affiliates around 98, 99 being set up. So we had a lot of success, but the question came, have we really achieved what our goal was? actually moving the needle for student achievement and where they would end up at the end of school? And honestly, the answer was no. That a lot of these things that we had pushed for over the years had not resulted in better results for children. And so then the question, well, what do we do? So our focus started to shift towards, well, what are the things that matter? How can we move the needle? How can we start to advocate for those things? And those areas centered around literacy, centered around high school success, centered around some of the areas, and for us in Memphis, we focus more on kind of how do we break the school to prison pipeline? What are the areas of discipline and social emotional learning and mental health? And so those became where we started to focus and say, well, what is it that really matters? How do we identify research-based practices, best practices that we then can advocate to come and put into the system? So that's what we've done here in Shelby County Schools, working with them around 9th grade on track, which was an effort that started in Chicago and saw a lot of success. And so we now work with Shelby County Schools, both traditional and charter schools, and 20 schools, helping to make sure 9th graders are on track. So if they're on track by the end of 9th grade, they're 3 to 4 times more likely to graduate. So that becomes a clear portion. What do we think about in terms of high school success? And that becomes what matters for what Russ used to work on around post-secondary success, and how do we gear young people towards what that looks like. So we've advocated for graduation coaches, post-secondary coaches, people who help students figure out, well, what am I going to do? Help them to figure out what is the pathway to that, and for high-quality career pathways. So we also partnered and advocated for a national organization, NAF, to come in and help to set up what are really structured, high-quality career pathways that are now in, I think, 4 of the schools, including the technical centers, with about 6 to 8 programs. And so, and then also around literacy, we partnered with a national expert around literacy. What is it that matters for literacy? What will work for literacy? One of the big things that's a big story here and that we focus on a lot. And what she told us, Dr. Nell Duke, who we work with, was that literacy coaches matter. That's one of the, really research-based strategies. And so we started pushing for that 3 or 4 years ago. And just recently, in the new plan that Shelby County Schools has around literacy, they have full-time literacy coaches. It's not exactly how we would say do it, research says, but it's getting closer because, I would say in part, because of the conversation that we start around, what is it that matters, and trying to be focused on what matters for children. Similarly, a lot of the work for STAND, even before I was at STAND, when Kenya Bradshaw ran it, was around education funding. We know that we need more education funding, and people will make the same argument that Tamika mentioned. Well, Memphis Shelby County Schools gets $12,000 per pupil in the simple math. Lakeland or Arlington does it with $8,000 per pupil. Again, just kind of a misdirection of thought in terms of who are the children that are being served, but also when we contextualize that in a national standpoint, then we know that Tennessee is at the bottom of the rungs in terms of just education funding generally. That might shift some with the new focus on education, $1 billion more supposedly going to education at the state level. But from a national perspective, we're getting an F in terms of what the state gives to education. And then when we think about what are we supplementing that with locally, if we compare to other places like DC or New Jersey, like Newark, you'll see that the numbers that Tamika was mentioning aren't out of bounds. $25,000, $30,000 per pupil is not out of the range. That is what they fund students for. And then when I think about, and this is what I always related to, having gone to a boarding school, right? Then we start to think about what is when we think of what is the real cost of education. And so even at a boarding school, with all of these privileged young people who some can write 4-year checks for the whole, segment of their education, those checks right now would probably be, I think it's around $50,000 a year, right? And even then, one of the things that always strikes me, I remember reading in one of our alumni books, there was a day that they celebrate on campus, or they recognize on campus, that this is the day that the money, even from your tuition, runs out. And it's about halfway through the year. So that money runs out, and everybody is on the financial aid of this huge endowment that the school has. So now you add that on, that's $100,000 per year for education. Now add on to that the things that the young people who I went to high school with got to do during breaks and during summers, and where they got to go visit, and where the kinds of experiences they had to have. Now you're upwards of $100,000+. So when we talk about what's the real cost of education, these are things that we don't necessarily consider. And we think about, well, in our context, okay, like they're doing it with $8,000, they're doing it with $12,000. Can't y'all just figure it out? But the real numbers are upwards of $100,000 if we're thinking about, even for privileged children, what it should cost to have a high rigor of education. And then when we bring that back and circle back to what are we getting as results, when we started talking about and went through the surrender of the charter, and around that time period, there was this mistaken notion that one district was doing better than another, in part complicity from the state. So Legacy Shelby County Schools would get an A, Legacy Memphis City Schools would get an F. And the difference in that number was
15 points.
15 points.
15 points.
Legacy Memphis City Schools had a 40, Legacy Shelby County Schools had a 55.
In math.
In math.
That's a real number.
So
out of 100, it's not out of 60.
Yeah.
On the state score, Shelby County math score was 55. Memphis was 40. The state said theirs was an A and that ours was a D. It was a D, not an F in math.
It was a D.
So people around here talking about Shelby County got straight A's. I'm like, they didn't have a score over 60 out of 100.
So we were all failing. All of our children are ostensibly being failed by the numbers. So what does that mean? So even now, so if we bring it to the current state and we think about the schools, and I think one of the things that is a potential benefit, if we think of that, of the surrender of the charter and the secession of the municipal school districts, is that you can actually compare discrete districts to one another, right? And that's actually beneficial, I think, for the children who are in those municipal school districts, because now they have to compete and they have to try to be better. So now you actually can compare Williamson County, a high net worth county, to the schools in Collierville or Lakeland or Arlington, where the incomes are similar. And so now we can see how are they serving the children that they serve and whether they're doing it well. And even if we look at that, when we think about what is a measure that our state uses about how well we're preparing children, a Ready Graduate measure. So Ready Graduate says how many students or what percentage of students in a school are getting a 21 or above on ACT or are having a certain number of post-secondary opportunities, certificates, things like that. And if we look at those numbers again, we'll see Memphis Shelby County Schools has a 23, a lot of space for growth there. But even the highest number, so if we look at Germantown or Arlington or Collierville, we'll see that their numbers are sub 70. So again, nowhere across the board. So when we start to think about our education and where we are, we have to have a real conversation about where are we achieving, where are we not. Across the board, are we serving our children well or not? And even if our most privileged children are not being served well or not being able to succeed to their fullest potential, what do we think is going to happen to the children who don't have all of those resources, who have the challenges in their homes, have the challenges of housing security or insecurity, have the challenges of food and transit and all of these other issues?
Thank you. And so I know we're at time. I know we started a little late, but we want to wrap this up. I mean, this could be a series of conversations because there's there's so much to discuss. I think what you hear is that just the vision should be that public education is all of our education. It is all of our business. We should all have a vision for it and really be at the table to push and not be satisfied when some school is not doing well. And when you're making an actual comparison, often, I don't even try to do the comparison between public education and private or independent education. We don't control the seats. It's compulsory education. If we have to educate imagine if every school in this community had to educate every kid that showed up at their door. You think they all would have the same level of performance? Let's be for real. And don't tell me 12,000 is enough if you're paying 20-some thousand tuition at one of the top schools here. And the 20,000 tuition plus the laptop and the trip and all the other stuff that you purchase. If you add all of that up, as Cardell was saying, you will realize our kids in public education get nowhere near what they need, but it is for all of us, and we need everybody to be engaged in it. And so, I don't know if we need to, is there time? Run a couple of questions? Okay. So we're gonna turn it over because we can keep going forever. Yeah.
Who's got questions?
How can we best support public education?
Cardell's gonna say, join Stand for Children. Go ahead, Cardell, Lieutenant.
I think that it's finding out, as folks say, how do I do anything? It's finding out what is the thing, there's something that everybody can do, and what is the thing that you can do. And there are multiple ways. For some people that will mean volunteering and mentoring or tutoring. There's a lot of opportunities to do that. For some people that will mean advocacy, and so we believe in systems level change, and that will mean, can I show up? Can I, take an action? Can I write to my school board member or county commissioner or city council person about the need for support for education of our children in the community? And so it depends on what is the particular role that you want to play. And I think that part of what we try to do is try to help people connect to what are those pieces that I can do and what I can do functionally. I would say that everybody can recognize what are the things that are going on, even from just kind of a summary area of understanding what is happening within our systems. Yeah. And from just a nominal level, how do I make sure that the people in our community are not blaming our children, yes, are not saying that there are things that, recently, and if we talk about the violence that we've seen in our community, and we see a lot of the calls right now for harsher sentences, for mandating children being sent from juvenile court to adult court, or for penalizing and punishing parents for what we might call truancy, or what we call in schools chronic absenteeism. And so again, it becomes, how do we reflect that back to what are the challenges that folks are facing in terms of transients, in whether they're going to the same school, of housing insecurity, which is on the rise in our community, of food and transit, where we know that we don't have a functional transit system that's funded to the level that it needs. So a lot of these pieces is trying to say to our mayors, to our city council, to our county commission, to our school board members, these are the places where we need to focus on broadly, what are the solutions that we can have? And then individually, like I mentioned for STAN and for some of the other organizations that advocate, is what is the particular thing that we want to focus on? So we do have to, I think that a few years ago, part of what we tried to do, we created an effort called Momentum Memphis, was try to think about how do we break down the barriers to people trying to figure out, what can I do about education? Because it's such a huge, it's an elephant, right? And it's like, well, how do I eat it? And so it's breaking it down to the component parts. So for us, again, I said it's literacy, high school success, mental health, and health. And so then within that, how do we select very specific things that we want to advocate for and start to impact those things that we then win or lose on? And we have to be willing to put a stake in the ground and say, we need to do this, and we're gonna win or lose based on that, but we're gonna continue to push for that, and everybody in the community can play a part.
Thank you. So I teach at a public school in North Memphis, teach 8th grade ELA. I teach a lot of very bright students who just don't have a lot of money. I work at a school where there are 6th grade classes with 40 plus students in them with no teacher support, where the gym has a leak in the roof and the district doesn't fix it, where doors don't latch, and where instead of getting subs, which there are actually a few subs out there, it's a common practice to just hold kids in homeroom all day and not have academics. We have a school district that already had one circus at the beginning of this year. We're now in the middle of another circus with the person that's at the next leadership level under them. And I am so in support of everything that's been said this morning. I think it's good, but it just breaks my heart for my students. And I guess my question is, when are we going to hold the adults accountable in this school system? Because there's a lot of stuff that's said on social media. There's a lot of stuff that's said at in-services, but actions speak louder than words.
So in response to the question about what we were going to do, I was going to say, you need to start holding the adults accountable for the system. So part of that is, 2,000 people vote in school board elections. People are just completely disconnected. People have paid no attention to who's on the school board. And I'm an advocate around school board politics, and I can tell you, so I ran for the school board because I was challenged by what I was seeing. at the board level. I had no interest in politics before that, and I ran because I was like, somebody needs to do something. And then one day in the mirror where I brushed my teeth, I said, why do you keep saying somebody? Like, why don't you go try to do something? But what I can tell you is that through the support of New Path and then the constant leadership push of Cardell and others, like, we actually moved that school board. Like, we did things different. There were systems changes that we started to put in place. So it does matter who's there. It doesn't matter who's there if people are gonna take a pass. So if I knock on the door and you're telling me, oh, I don't care, my kids don't go to the school system. So part of it is that a system, a demand, we need a demand generation from the public that, number one, the adults are doing better. That there is a real vision for public education, but it has to start, we each have to have a vision, right? That it's, if I have kids or don't have kids, what's the vision for education for your kids? Why would you accept less than that for this system? And then actually hold the system and ask the right questions. So with all due respect, if you hear a mayor saying that the answer to our problems is just tougher sentencing laws, you gotta know it's not just that. There's a much deeper need in this community than just tougher sentencing laws, right? That is not preventative. How do you prevent these things and be asking the questions around school system and county commission and city council, all you know, what are you doing to set this community up so that we are preventing these things? Because we know when communities thrive, they thrive. And so I would put that back. Let's hold the organizations accountable. It worked on the board when people reached out to the board. I was shocked at the level of people who didn't think they should reach out to the school board. So you should be reaching out to your school board member and expressing those issues too.
And I would just to add, you know, knowing some of the pieces about the system. I think, you know, for us, the facilities is a huge issue. We got $500 million in need for our schools.
For decades, we've had that.
And we've had that for decades. It became a point to me where when it's one of these things, we have several things in our community that are just illogical that we accept. We have a transit system that can't move people around the city in less than 3 hours, but we have a company that's here that can move packages around the world in a day.
Yeah.
Things that don't make sense. One of the things, and I mentioned this to my boss one day, and I was saying, hey, we got this $500 million in deferred maintenance, and his response to me was like, aren't people upset about that? Aren't they doing anything? And it hit me like,
no.
We just accepted, and from that point on, it became a part of our advocacy. And how do we create this outside of just the individual school that has a roofing need to this is a broad need, and we have a need to invest upwards of $1 billion in the facilities of our community. But that also means that we need to, then that goes to our county commission and even our city. They don't invest. And our city to say that this is a need that we demand because our children see it, and that is a matter of whether they think we value them or not. And that's just a baseline. Can we have a facility where you can teach a class and feel comfortable going in and children's heads are going to be licked on? Like, so there are some fundamental pieces where also understanding at what level we need to advocate and who we need to push and pressure, and acceptance for us as community members that we're going to have to pay for it. We have a low tax burden, and we talk about property taxes all the time, but whereas we might have a high property tax, we overall have a low tax burden. But what they get us on is focus on the property tax rate, and people are winning. Businesses are winning. People with higher incomes, like us in this room probably, are winning because we pay a lower property tax than we should, and we pay lower tax on other things. But the expense of that is that we don't have buildings that are great. We don't have we don't have these other things. So we also have to be willing to say, okay, these are problems, and I'm willing to pay to fix them.
Imagine if everyone who was seeking elected office went into that scenario knowing I have to answer the question of deferred maintenance for our school system, or I don't stand a chance in this election because our community demands that question. Doesn't matter what the office is. School board, just take school board out of it. I mean any office. What are you gonna do if you're on the county commission, city council, etc., to work with the school system, the state, the city, etc., private industry, to help address our deferred maintenance issue? If you can't answer that question, you're not competitive. We control that, because I can assure you anybody who wants to be an elected official will get their act together. We control that. we've got 20 plus years of data that says we have no intention of addressing the deferred maintenance issue for any of our public schools. If there's a drop of water at this school right here that comes through somebody's classroom, it's going to get fixed. That's not a criticism, that's a compliment.
We
Again,
just want that for all schools.
these are basics. These are the fundamentals. If we can't demand that for every school, then we don't have a chance to be high-minded in thinking about having dynamic arts programs. Imagine that. Imagine if we could do that. Let's get the buildings fixed first.
I think we have probably time for maybe one or two more questions.
I was going to ask, with sort of money being kind of the big issue, and that's something I've been looking at recently as I sort of do my own. I mentioned that I'm kind of learning about the school district, doing some history stuff, and one of the lenses I'm trying to look through is poverty and how that's affecting things. And so I kind of just generally wanted to know your thoughts on the state student funding formula as that kind of adds different weights for things like concentrated poverty, and therefore students get more money individually in addition to the base funding that they get. So kind of what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's going to help things?
So I'm going to answer that or speak to that briefly from a little bit of a outside looking in, even though I worked for an organization that spent a lot of time working on that. But let me just say, I am encouraged by how this is unfolding. And it's really there were unprecedented statewide real conversations across every type of district, scenario, community, and there are so many in this state. I'm sure there are going to be adjustments along the way for how the resources truly get allocated, but it was a big step in our state to actually have comprehensive conversations and to raise our hand and say, we have to put more resources into public education. It's not disconnected from the fact that the state has more money now than it's ever had before. So to me, the magic is what happens when the budget gets tight? Do we go away from this? Cardell, I'm sure, has more to say on this, but just from the standpoint of doing a much more transparent, authentic step into reinvestment in education, I'm much more encouraged by that from a state standpoint than I've ever been in my time living in Tennessee.
Carter, you might want to ground it in what we're talking about, because everybody might.
Yeah, for everybody. The state funding formula has recently changed through the last legislative cycle to what they call TISA, which means that it moves from a resource-based funding formula. Basically, what are the inputs that we expect or assume should be in schools, and then giving a bucket of money to schools based on what that is. Here's the number of books the school system needs, teachers, based on a certain set of assumptions. To more of a student-based funding formula, which is here's a base level of funding for a student, and then a student who is economically disadvantaged has additional needs, so let's give them an additional amount. A student who's English language learner has additional needs, and give them a little bit more. A student who's a student with disabilities, let's give them a little bit more, and then let's add on some things for performance and for some other areas of programmatic pieces. So that is the shift. It's a similar shift locally in Memphis and in Nashville, Davidson, that had been made to a student funding formula, a school-based funding formula, which was similar. Let's give a base level to schools, and then let's give more to students who are in schools that have this type of demographics. And so I think with both of those pieces, like Russ mentioned, it's a good start. It gets us to, one, a level of getting funds closer to students and students' needs. And it also gets us more clarity around a focus on who are the students with needs and what are the numbers that should help them to advance. And so that number, to Russ's point, hopefully will change. I think there's some shifts that can be made. There's adjustments that will be made over time, but it's a good shift that I think was made by the state to start to move us closer to understanding what are the dollars that we're spending on a child or in a school, and then have that be based on who are the actual students being served, not some overall broad assumption of here's what should happen or what would be in every school, with only, even the old formula had a small amount around economic disadvantaged students, but it was a fairly small percentage of the funding formula at that time.
Yeah, I would just say the, bottom line of how we fund education, including that formula, like wherever you are on the political spectrum, if you're conservative, you should be saying government should spend no more than it needs in public education to get a world-class system. And if you're on the other end, government should be spending as much as it takes to get a world-class education, and those dollars should be the same. That should be the same result.
May we give our panelists and our facilitator a round of applause, please? Thank you so much. I'm not sure if y'all have time for questions afterwards, but there may be a few more. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today. And every third Sunday of each month, the Social Justice Ministry gathers in thoughtful ways. Thank you for being a part today. This involves all of us. Thank you again.
Thank you.